Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden of Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, we started out the year on January 1st, as every year begins, but with huge news that came out of China about the outlawing of the domestic ivory trade. And that was really exciting for people because it's something that for years activists and conservationists had been wanting for the Chinese to finally do something to cut the demand. You know, the wildlife group Traffic says when the buying stops, the killing stops. And so there's this hope, this feeling, this sense that in some ways the battle to save Africa's elephants has been won, that China finally did what it needed to do to stop the trade in illegal ivory. Well, of course, we know that is not the case, even though the Chinese have changed their laws and are about to implement this law towards the end of the year. We know the killing is going on. In fact, there's a whole bunch of new news reports coming out this week that suggest that the trade in ivory is as active as ever. And in so many ways, Cobus, this is just really the continuation of one of the world's most depressing stories.
It really is. And so we had this idea that a big Chinese domestic ivory ban will be the death knell to Chinese domestic ivory demand. And it turns out, big surprise, that's not really how it works. Demand is continuing, and there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be going into attacking that demand in other ways, and particularly attacking the kind of criminal networks around the world that feed that demand. Now, I think new research is coming out that shows that those criminal networks are a lot more complicated than we had anticipated before, and that there's a lot about them that we still don't know how they work.
So today we're going to be talking about the illegal ivory trade, and we're going to focus on one very, very specific part of it. But before we get into that discussion, let's kind of set the tone here. The going rate for ivory, as far as I know, according to press reports, is about $1,100 per kilo. And that right there is the driving force. There are few other products in the world that demand that much money per kilo. And it is just incredible. Save the Elephants, which is one of the better known environmental groups, just published a new report that said the population of elephants now stands at somewhere around 415,000. That's according to the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Save the Elephants is talking about how Laos has now become one of the world's centers in ivory trading, and that Chinese consumers are just crossing over the border into Southeast Asia, into countries like Laos and Vietnam to buy. And it really reveals how the ivory trade has changed over the past 9 or 10 months, in part because of what the Chinese policies have, but yet the demand is not there. Now, there's one very interesting wrinkle in all of this, and that comes out of all places, North Korea. And North Korea is a country that certainly we don't talk about very much. It's under enormous sanctions. Of course, what we're talking about today when it comes to North Korea is the nuclear standoff between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. But a new report came out by Julian Rademeyer, which is absolutely fascinating. Diplomats in Deceit, North Korea's criminal activities in Africa. And this was written for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, which is a group out of Geneva, Switzerland. And it studies the illicit crime and smuggling networks of ivory in Africa by North Korean diplomats. And we are thrilled to have Julian on the show for the very first time. Thank you so much, Julian.
Absolute pleasure. Great to be on.
And just a little bit of background about Julian. He's an award-winning South African investigative journalist and is also currently leading a project for the international wildlife conservation NGO Traffic on the protection of African wildlife and ecosystems. So, Julian, I had to get your full introduction there. Just so excited to have you on the program to talk about this. North Korea is not a country that we associate with Africa. It's not a country that we associate certainly with the ivory trade. What made you kind of stumble onto the North Korean aspect of the illegal shipment, smuggling, trade in African ivory? How did this come across your radar?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, North Korea was quite a puzzle. I spent the last 7 years or so looking at the illegal rhino horn trade. And a lot of that focus obviously has been on criminal networks, some of them from Vietnam, some from Thailand, others from China, who are driving this particular trade, and contributing to mass slaughter of rhinos on the African continent. I think it's 7,100 animals that have been killed, rhinos that have been killed over the last decade. Today, the African population stands at around 25,000. But North Korea was not something that really came onto my radar until about 2 years ago, when a North Korean diplomat and a taekwondo master were arrested in Mozambique, in the capital Maputo. And they were traveling in an embassy 4x4. Police who searched the vehicle found $100,000 in cash and 4.5 kilograms of rhino horn. And it just seemed to be this incredibly odd story. What was a diplomat and a taekwondo master? The taekwondo master was later alleged to be a North Korean spy. What were they doing driving around with that much cash and rhino horn? And I worked on a report for the Global Initiative at the time, looking at a broader picture around the rhino horn trade, and began looking into the question of diplomats and diplomatic involvement. And we'd had a couple of high-profile incidents in South Africa where Vietnamese diplomats had been implicated in smuggling rhino horn. But the more I dug and going back into records over the last 30 years, back to around 1986, the more North Koreans turned up. There was something of an ebb and flow in that activity. And the research we've done, we identified around 29 cases of diplomatic involvement in smuggling ivory and rhino horn, and 18 of those cases turned out to involve North Korean diplomats. Now, this was an issue that had been flagged in around 1989 by the Environmental Investigation Agency, who put out a report at the time suggesting that the entire North Korean embassy in Zimbabwe at that stage was implicated in smuggling ivory and rhino horn. And it was a pretty hard-hitting report describing those activities. And, it was considered that those illicit activities, once that embassy was ultimately shut down, that those activities faded away. But in the course of this research, we found other incidents over the years, some as late as 1999, and then more recently a pickup in detection of diplomatic involvement, one case in 2012, and then the 2015 case, and then most recently 2 cases in Ethiopia in September and October 2016.
And so, just to clarify, how much of that ivory and rhino horn go to North Korea itself, or is North Korea acting as a way station on the way to China?
Well, that's one of the big mysteries. I did a number of interviews with defectors, some of them quite high-level defectors, about smuggling of rhino horn, ivory, and other products, everything from gold and cigarettes to diamonds. And some of them did make mention of consumption of rhino horn in North Korea, but said that it was extremely expensive, which it is, and that it was only a small percentage of the population who could actually afford it. But North Korea historically doesn't seem to have that much had that much of a market for rhino horn. Certainly in the 1970s and 80s, there was trade to South Korea, but North Korea has always been a bit of a mystery. And it does seem that in most of these cases, these are diplomats who are on their way to China, traveling to Beijing and other parts of China. And, according to one of the defectors we spoke to who ran a front company for the North Korean government based in Beijing, he would connect diplomats with Chinese organized crime groups or people who were looking to buy rhino horn and ivory. So it does seem that a lot of that trade is destined for China. Yeah, and these are essentially bagmen.
Yeah, that would be the logical assumption, is that's where the market is, whether it's in China or now, as we're seeing, to countries like Laos or Vietnam, where Chinese consumers go to buy. But obviously they want to move the ivory as a way to make money, in part because North Korea is probably the most isolated country in the world, for a number of different reasons. One of them is because of these, suffocating international sanctions. And those sanctions over the past few weeks have intensified as the Trump administration, the United Nations, and even China have really pushed harder, in part because they want to clamp down on North Korea's nuclear program and their launching of various missiles over Japan and South Korea and over the neighboring oceans. So, but you make this interesting point in your report that said there is a link between the intensity of the sanctions and North Korea's illicit activities in Africa. Make that link for us. What's the connection between those two?
Well, I think there certainly is a real danger that as sanctions become more stringent, as North Korea's access to funding is cut off, that it could lead to an expansion of these activities, these sorts of criminal activities, and a need to find dark money, to find illicit funds to support the regime. But there's a dual element to all of this. Another aspect of it is that North Korean diplomats are incredibly poorly paid. An ambassador will earn somewhere in the region of $1,000 a month. Other diplomats will earn far less. So, and there's a requirement on them to pay certain amounts back to the regime in loyalty money. So I think this fulfills a dual role. One is that it allows diplomats to raise funds for themselves and to save as much money as possible. And then secondly, it provides funding that goes to support the regime. Certainly I think one of the defectors that I interviewed said that the opportunity that's presented by going abroad is that you can try and make as much money as possible. It's an opportunity to be seized upon.
Do you have an impression now about how the coming full Chinese ban on domestic ivory trade is going to impact this, or will it have any kind of impact on this trade?
I'm not sure it'll have much impact on this. I mean, I think for the diplomats primarily who are involved in this, this is an opportunity to commit almost the perfect crime. I mean, aside from the bungling and the strangeness of some of these seizures, they're abusing their immunities in terms of the Vienna Convention. They are largely untouchable. There are very few law enforcement officials who will stop or arrest a diplomat, even if they do find contraband items in their luggage. That certainly was the case with two of the incidents in Ethiopia recently, where the individuals involved identified themselves as diplomats and were let go, even though in one case someone was found with 76 pieces of worked ivory, one of the diplomats, and in the second case with 200 ivory bangles. So, I think this is a different kind of trade in a way. And I think that the underground trade is certainly going to continue going on, no matter what does happen with the current ivory ban. In fact, there's a very real danger it'll push it even deeper underground.
Cobus, it's interesting to hear Julian describe the situation because it reminds me of a couple of years ago when the Environmental Investigation Agency, which is a group out of London that Julian referred to earlier, they also issued a report about how when Xi Jinping visited Africa, the price of ivory went up simply because Chinese diplomats and Chinese officials were buying so much ivory to bring back on the presidential plane. Of course, the Chinese government denied this, but there was a lot of supporting evidence, at least presented by the EIA, that suggested as much. So the North Koreans certainly aren't the only ones who are using the cover of diplomatic immunity to kind of take advantage of buying ivory. And I just thought that was an interesting. Again, there seem to be some parallels here.
Yeah, there's definitely some parallels, and there's also parallels with wider kind of organized crime in relation to diplomats. There's been scandals in South Africa about other things. I think drugs, if I remember correctly, being smuggled by South African diplomats in the past. So I mean, the question then becomes to which extent the diplomatic system as we know it is sustainable, and if it becomes more and more kind of infiltrated by criminal activity, whether that system itself will have to be reformed. Julian, what do you think? Like, how do you see the system going on in the future?
Well, I think, that's the thing. I mean, the Vienna Convention, which gives diplomats the immunities that they have and those diplomatic privileges, was never intended as a get-out-of-jail-free card, do anything you want. And certainly it does allow, in certain cases, for diplomats' bags to be searched, for diplomats' baggage to be searched, if there are serious grounds for presuming that they contain articles not covered by the exemptions. But the cases where that does happen are extremely rare. And I think, in North Korea's case, and certainly in the case of Chinese diplomats, Vietnamese diplomats too, there are very few countries in Africa that have strong diplomatic ties with them who are prepared to risk a diplomatic incident and take additional steps against a diplomat who's caught in this way. In most instances, they are generally asked to leave the country. They're not declared a persona non grata, and it becomes a very informal process. So that is one problematic element of it. But I think that if we could encourage law enforcement agencies to A, be aware of their rights in terms of the Vienna Convention, and B, to begin looking into these sorts of cases, that could change it.
I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into your research on the North Korean role in the African ivory trade. Are they simply these diplomats, and I'm assuming, is it only diplomats, or are there other actors, other North Korean actors, whether they're illegal crime syndicates, corporations, or is it just diplomats that we're focusing on here?
It seems to be primarily diplomats, although there are other actors on the fringes. There are people traveling with other types of passports, North Korean passports. We've got cases where money launderers, for instance, who are using diplomatic passports but are very loosely affiliated to embassies, seem to play a very key role in ferreting away cash, moving money around. But there does seem to be quite large-scale abuse of North Korean diplomatic passports. I mean, to the extent that the U.S. State Department put out a warning earlier this year, urging that North Korean officials claiming to be diplomats be subjected to strict scrutiny, and that there are multiple instances where North Korea has abused diplomatic privileges to facilitate prohibited activities.
Okay, so if it's diplomats, what exactly is their role in the trade? Are they working with African organized crime syndicates? Are they working with corrupt officials within the Kenyan Wildlife Service? Are they at that level, or are they simply buyers and transporting out under the cover of diplomatic immunity to bring it to a middle market where it can be sold to Chinese buyers?
They seem to be primarily buyers and bagmen. I haven't seen any evidence of direct links between diplomats and poaching gangs on the ground or corrupt officials. And I think that area is something that requires much more investigation. Is where do they obtain this from? Those links remain something of a mystery. And I think the problem we have here. I mean, when we say we've identified 18 cases over the last 30 years involving North Korean diplomats, those are cases that have been detected and reported on primarily at airports. There's very little other, very few other investigations that have gone into that. So there's a missing piece in this puzzle. And I think, one of the defectors I spoke to summed it up fairly well when he said that finding corrupt people, finding people to help out with illicit activities isn't actually that hard. You go to a new country, there's already potentially a base to work from that the embassy has set up previously, a base of contacts. You meet new people, you get to know them over coffee or over lunch, and over a period of time you build up a relationship, and then you start testing the boundaries to see, are they prepared to do business? What can they get me? So I think, some of these diplomats actively seek out potential business partners in that way.
And, so to ask you a slightly wider question, you work closely with Traffic, the NGO that focuses a lot on also combating demand for ivory and rhino horn in China through very innovative ad campaigns. And they've in the past made the point that they feel among young Chinese the demand for ivory is starting to fall, thanks to the coming domestic ban, but also thanks to some of the work that they did, which characterizes ivory as something old people like. What do you think can be done about Chinese demand in the long run? Are we faced with the problem of unmovable Chinese demand that will remain high forever, or do you see that demand actually declining over the long term?
I don't think it's unmovable. I think it's going to be, a difficult struggle. I think you referred earlier to a Wild Aid campaign about, when the buying stops, the killing can too, which is quite an effective slogan. But certainly, I mean, we are seeing in our monitoring of online markets and our market monitoring activity that there is demand for a range of things. I mean, obviously from ivory carvings, but also on the rhino horn side, pendants and bracelets and bangles and so on. And I think that it's an extremely long and difficult struggle, which has to be tackled on a number of different levels. Certainly, you need more effective law enforcement. You need demand reduction campaigns that are aimed at changing consumer behavior. And you need political will and support. And I think that's what's encouraging, at least in the ivory ban that's been imposed. But it's and I think also we've seen in recent times increasing numbers of seizures in China, although still relatively small. But if you take between 2016 and this month, September 2017, mainland China had around 5 big seizures of rhino horn, which is quite a small amount. But what was important about that is that these were proactive seizures. These were not seizures that took place at airports when a bag went through a scanner and rhino horn was discovered. These were seizures where police obtained information and acted on that information. And I think that's quite encouraging. So I think it's very easy to make sweeping statements about China and the illegal rhino horn and ivory markets. But there are, it's a much more complex picture than that. I think that there are real efforts in some places to try and make a difference and make a change.
That may be the case, but at $1,100 a kilo, with demand still quite significant, let's just end our discussion on a yes or no question. Is there enough time? That is, the population of elephants continues to fall, the poaching continues to go on. Can the policymaking process keep up with the poachers to the point where it can actually stop the killing?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And, I think that the difficulty that you have is that governments, international organizations, police, law enforcement agencies all move very slowly and very bureaucratically. And the criminal networks involved in this adapt very quickly. They change routes, they change methods. And their job is to get as much of that product, be it rhino horn, be it ivory, to market. They're deeply entrenched in many cases. They're utterly ruthless in the methods that they use. And that ultimately is what you're up against. In the case of rhino horn, you're looking at prices that are significantly higher than ivory. So you've got a twofold struggle here. And I don't have the answer to that question. I don't think anyone really does. But certainly, if you're losing 20,000 elephants a year, if you're losing over 1,000 rhinos a year, and you have the population sizes that you do, it doesn't look terribly optimistic.
The report is Diplomats and Deceit, North Korea's Criminal Activities in Africa, which was written for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime out of Geneva, Switzerland. It's a fascinating report and one that really reveals a different side and complexity of the ivory trade. And I think, as we heard from Julian, that there are so many conflicting reasons as to what is propelling this. So from the fact that the diplomats only make $1,000 a month or so little, they're using this to pay for their own salaries. And at the same time, it's probably being used to pay for the North Korean state as they're being choked by international sanctions. There's just no other ways for them to make money through other than these illicit activities. And of course, the North Koreans have been known for decades of doing horrific things in the black market. So really, this is not surprising that they're involved in the ivory trade. Julian is an award-winning South African journalist and is also working for the NGO Traffic on the protection of African wildlife and ecosystems. Julian, thank you so much for taking the time and for the excellent work you've done on the report.
Thank you for having me on. Great pleasure.
If people want to follow what you're doing and what you're reading and writing, are you on social media at all? That they can kind of keep in touch with what you're doing?
I am indeed. I'm on Twitter at Julian Rademeyer, and then I've also got a website from the book perspective, killingforprofit.com.
Killing for Profit, Exposing the Illegal Rhino Horn Trade is the best-selling book, so go check that out. Julian, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, Cobus, I am not sure whether to be excited that we know more about the underbelly of the ivory trade, or even more depressed that it's more complicated, more corrupt, and more vast than we had ever imagined, that even the North Koreans are there involved in this trade. And again, I understand what's propelling this, which is, of course, is money and the demand from the China market. There's no doubt in my mind that that's the connection between it. But it's this war is not over. And I just feel like a little bit that environmentalists and conservationists and various activists are not as vocal anymore about elephants, and they should be.
I agree. I think it's now is really the time to ratchet up campaigns rather than to wind them down. To that extent, I think Julian's work is amazing because it does show how complicated these networks are and how resilient they are. And I was thinking as he was talking about it, it's such a weird thing how from the criminals' perspectives, they in a way being excellent. They're kind of like workers in a capitalist system. They're trying to be more efficient. They're trying to be more resilient. They're disrupting the industry. So you can describe all of their work in weird kind of Wall Street terms or Silicon Valley terms. And I think it's crucial that we know more about how this works in order to combat it more effectively. But I agree with you. The machinery is moving too slow, and the rate of killing is too high. So we might really run out of time.
I'm one, and if anybody who's been listening to the show for a couple of years, they'll have heard me say this before, that I think I don't think this ends well for most of Africa's elephants and rhinos. I just think the demand is too large. The markets are too unregulated, and it's just a sad story. So on that very depressing note, we will end this week's show. We'll be back again next week, and then we're here every week. But again, if you want to stay on top of some China-Africa news, sign up for our newsletter. It goes out every Monday. You can get it over at ChinaAfricaProject.com. There's a little pop-up box that appears. Also on our Facebook page, you can sign up there as well at Facebook.com/ChinaAfricaProject. It's a great little newsletter. Cobus and I curate the top stories every week and then fling them out to you. So it's a nice way to kind of, just get a little appetizer of China-Africa news if you're not really kind of that intense about it and don't want to go into it every day. So we invite you to get our newsletter every Monday. We'll send it out. So we'll be back again next week with another edition of the show. For Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show, or follow China Africa News that's updated every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadenesque or Eric at E. Olander. That's EOLANDER. Subscribe to the China Africa podcast on iTunes or download the mobile apps for iOS, Android, or Windows Phone. Just head over to your favorite store and search for China Africa.